There's a gate in the walls of an old city that hasn't been opened in over 500 years. It's called the Golden Gate, and it was built to be walked through by triumphant emperors returning from war, their soldiers marching behind them, their enemies in chains. For 1,000 years, this single stretch of wall did something almost no fortification in human history has ever done. It kept the most powerful armies on earth on the outside. Persians, Avars, Arabs, Bulgarians, Rus raiders with 1,000 ships. All of them came. All of them failed. And then, on a spring morning in 1453, after 53 days of cannon fire that shook the ground for miles, the walls finally broke. And when they did, an empire that had lasted longer than almost any in history simply stopped existing. This is the story of Constantinople. Not just a city, but a fortress, a marketplace, a cathedral, and a battlefield, all packed onto one narrow strip of land between two seas. It was founded before Rome was a superpower. It outlived the Roman Empire that built it, and its fall changed the world so completely that historians still use it to mark the end of the Middle Ages. So how did a small Greek trading post on a peninsula become the most fought-over city on the planet? And why, after standing for over 2,000 years, did it finally fall in a single day? Let's start at the beginning, because the reason Constantinople mattered so much was baked into the ground it was built on. A city built on a choke point. Picture a map of the Eastern Mediterranean. On one side, the Aegean Sea, connected to the wider Mediterranean world. On the other, the Black Sea, a massive trade route running deep into what is now Russia and Ukraine. Between them runs a narrow strait called the Bosporus, and right where that strait meets another body of water called the Sea of Marmara, there's a peninsula shaped almost like a triangle, with a natural harbor curling along one side called the Golden Horn. Whoever controlled that peninsula controlled every ship that wanted to move between two seas. Not most ships, every ship. Around 657 BC, a group of Greek colonists from a city called Megara sailed into this exact spot. According to the old stories, their leader, a man named Byzas, had consulted the oracle at Delphi before setting out, and the oracle told him to build his city opposite the blind. Nobody understood what that meant until they arrived and found another Greek colony already sitting on the Asian side of the strait, at a spot called Chalcedon. Byzas looked at the European shore, with its deep sheltered harbor and total command of the strait, and realized the people at Chalcedon had settled on the wrong side entirely. They'd had the better location staring them in the face and missed it. That's why the oracle called them blind. Byzas built his city on the correct side, named it Byzantium after himself, and unknowingly founded a settlement that would still be making headlines 25 centuries later. For the next several hundred years, Byzantium lived the life of a small but valuable prize. The Persian king Darius I occupied it during a military campaign. Sparta and Athens fought over it because whoever held Byzantium controlled the grain ships sailing down from the Black Sea, and Athens in particular could not survive without that grain. Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, laid siege to the city and failed to take it. Through all of this, Byzantium survived, not because it had a massive army, but because of where it sat on the map. Geography was its superpower, and that single fact is going to explain almost everything that happened for the next 2,000 years. Rome eventually absorbed the city, and for a while it operated quietly as a client city within the empire. But even under Roman rule, its strategic value never went away, and that became violently clear in the year 196 AD. The Roman Empire was tearing itself apart in a civil war between two rival claimants to the throne, and Byzantium made the mistake of backing the loser, a general named Pescennius Niger. The winner, Emperor Septimius Severus, didn't forgive that. He besieged the city for 3 brutal years, tore down its walls, and stripped it of its privileges as punishment. But here's the twist, and it's a pattern you're going to see repeat throughout this story. Severus looked at the ruins of the city he'd just crushed, and instead of abandoning it, he rebuilt it. He understood exactly why Byzantium mattered. He expanded its infrastructure, laid the groundwork for what would become the Hippodrome, the great arena that would later host chariot races in front of 100,000 people and gave the city a stronger foundation than it had ever had before. Byzantium had been punished and rebuilt in the same breath. That cycle, destruction followed by an even grander rebuilding, is going to define this city's entire existence. And a little over a century later, one man was going to take that cycle to a scale nobody had ever imagined. A new Rome rises in the year 324 AD. A Roman emperor named Constantine, the first won a decisive battle against his last remaining rival, a man named Licinius, and became sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire. Constantine now had a problem that had nothing to do with warfare and everything to do with geography. Rome, the empire's traditional capital, sat awkwardly far from the frontiers that actually mattered most. The Danube River, where Germanic and Gothic tribes constantly pressed against the border. The Euphrates, where the Persian Empire loomed as a permanent rival. Rome was a symbol, but it was in the wrong place to actually run an empire under threat from two directions at once. Constantine needed a new capital, and when he looked at his options, one location stood out immediately: the old city of Byzantium. It sat almost perfectly between the Danube and the Euphrates frontiers. It had a defensible peninsula. It had that legendary harbor, and it could be resupplied by sea from almost anywhere in the Mediterranean world. So Constantine made his decision, and what followed was one of the most ambitious construction projects in ancient history. He personally marked out the boundary of the new city's western wall, tracing the line with his own spear, expanding the city's footprint to nearly 3 times its previous size. He built a grand central avenue called the Misi, lined with columns, running past the imperial palace, the Senate house, and an expanded hippodrome. He shipped in statues from ancient sanctuaries across Greece and Asia Minor to decorate his new capital, essentially looting classical antiquity to furnish his modern city. Thousands of workers labored on the project, and on May 11th, 330 AD, Constantine officially dedicated the city as Nova Roma, New Rome. The name never really caught on. Everyone just started calling it Constantinople instead, the city of Constantine, and the name stuck for the next 1100 years. But founding a capital and sustaining one are two very different challenges. A city this size needed food, water, and people, and over the following century, Constantinople had to solve all 3 problems or the whole project would collapse. Rome had traditionally been fed by grain shipments from Egypt. Constantine rerouted those shipments to his new capital instead, essentially transplanting an entire empire's food supply chain to a different city. Water was an even bigger engineering challenge, solved decades later when Emperor Valens completed a staggering aqueduct system stretching over 250 kilometers from springs in Thrace, feeding into massive underground cisterns beneath the city. And people came by the tens of thousands, drawn by legal incentives, construction jobs, and the sheer gravitational pull of being near the imperial court. By the year 400, somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 people called Constantinople home, a genuinely staggering number for the ancient world. So by the early 5th century, Constantinople had solved the problem of how to live. But it hadn't yet solved the problem of how to survive an attack. And that problem was about to become urgent, because just a few decades earlier, in 378 AD, a Roman army had been annihilated by Gothic forces at the Battle of Adrianople, and Gothic raiders had swept right up to the edges of Thrace, dangerously close to the capital itself. The message was clear. A wealthy, undefended city sitting near unstable frontiers was a target. Constantinople needed walls unlike anything that had ever been built before. And that's exactly what it got. The walls that held for 800 years between 408 and 413 AD, during the reign of the young Emperor Theodosius II. A prefect named Anthemius directed the construction of a new defensive system roughly 2 kilometers west of the city's old wall line. What they built wasn't just a wall. It was a defense system with layers, each one designed to absorb and slow down an attacking force before it ever reached the city itself. First came a deep, water-filled moat up to 20 meters wide and 10 meters deep. Behind that, a low outer wall, roughly 8 meters high, studded with towers. Behind that, an elevated terrace. And behind that, the main event, an inner wall 12 meters high and nearly 5 meters thick, reinforced by 96 massive towers rising up to 20 meters into the sky. An attacking army didn't just face one obstacle. They faced 4, stacked one behind another, each one covered by archers and defenders positioned to fire down from an advantage no siege engine of the era could easily overcome. These walls were tested almost immediately, and not just by human armies. In the year 447, a series of powerful earthquakes tore through the region and collapsed 57 of the wall's towers, along with large sections of the fortification. This could not have happened at a worse moment, because Attila the Hun was advancing through Thrace with his army at that exact time, and Constantinople's greatest defense now lay in ruins. What happened next tells you everything about how this city operated under pressure. A prefect named Constantine mobilized the city's chariot racing fan clubs, the Blues and the Greens, essentially turning sports hooligans into an emergency labor force. And in just 60 days, they rebuilt the entire fortification line, added an additional outer wall for good measure, and redug the moat. 60 days. Attila's advance stalled, and the walls held. This wasn't the last time civic organizations built for entertainment would end up saving the empire, but we'll get to that. The Theodosian walls, as they came to be known, weren't just brute force stone and mortar either. Byzantine engineers built the towers and the connecting wall panels as separate structures, without rigidly locking them together. That might sound like a design flaw, but it was actually brilliant. It created flexible joints that let each section of wall settle and shift slightly during earthquakes without the whole structure cracking apart. And beneath the moat itself, archaeologists have found 19 internal masonry bulkheads, essentially dams within the ditch. If an attacking army managed to drain one section of the moat, the other 18 sections stayed full, meaning nobody could simply empty the entire defensive ditch in one move. This was a defensive system built by people who had clearly thought about every possible way it could fail, and then engineered around each one. For the next several centuries, this wall would turn back army after army. But the greatest test of the city wasn't going to come from outside its gates. It was going to come from a riot that started inside them, and it would nearly burn the entire capital to the ground before giving one emperor the opportunity to build the most famous building in the city's history. Riots, plague, and the birth of Hagia Sophia by the 6th century, Constantinople was ruled by Justinian I, an emperor with enormous ambitions to reunify the fractured Roman world. But in January of 532, those ambitions nearly ended before they began. Public anger over high taxes and the execution of rioters from those same blue and green chariot racing factions boiled over into open rebellion. What became known as the Nika riots tore through the heart of the capital. Rioters torched the Senate House, the public baths, and the 4th century Basilica of Hagia Sophia, burning it to the ground. Justinian reportedly considered fleeing the city entirely. According to the historian Procopius, it was his wife, the Empress Theodora, who convinced him to stay and fight rather than run. Justinian ordered his generals, Belisarius and Mundus, to trap the rioters inside the Hippodrome, the same arena that had hosted so many of the city's chariot races, and the result was a massacre. An estimated 30,000 people were killed in a single brutal suppression. Now here's where that destruction and rebuilding cycle comes back around, on a scale nobody had attempted before. With the center of the city in ashes, Justinian had an opportunity most rulers never get. A completely blank canvas in the heart of his own capital. He commissioned 2 architects, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, to design a replacement for the burned-out cathedral, and what they built in just 5 years between 532 and 537 was Hagia Sophia. A central dome 31 meters across, seemingly floating above the building thanks to a ring of windows at its base, supported by an engineering technique called pendentives that transferred the dome's immense weight down through 4 massive piers. The interior was covered in imported marble and gold mosaics designed to catch and reflect light, meant to make anyone standing inside feel like they had stepped into heaven itself. It became, and remains, one of the most influential buildings ever constructed, and it turned Constantinople into the spiritual capital of Eastern Christianity. But Justinian's reign, for all its architectural triumph, also delivered the city's greatest catastrophe. In 541 and 542, a devastating outbreak, now known as the Justinianic Plague, swept through Constantinople, killing an estimated 5,000 people a day at its worst point. The city that had just rebuilt its skyline was now burying its population by the thousands. It's a brutal reminder that for every triumph in this city's history, there's usually a disaster sitting right next to it. And the plague wasn't even the biggest threat on the horizon. Because in the century that followed, Constantinople was about to face something it had never encountered before. Enemies who didn't just want to raid the city, but wanted to erase the empire that had built it entirely. Surrounded, the age of sieges by the early 7th century, Constantinople had transformed from an open, thriving late antique metropolis into something closer to a fortress state, permanently braced for attack. And it needed to be, because in 626 AD, while Emperor Heraclius was off fighting the Persians in the east, a massive coalition of Avars, Slavs, and Persian forces surrounded the city on both land and sea. This should have been catastrophic. Instead, the Byzantine navy prevented the Persian army from ever crossing the Bosporus to reinforce the siege, and the Theodosian walls held firm against everything the Avars threw at them. The Patriarch reportedly led processions along the walls carrying a sacred icon of the Virgin Mary, and whether you credit the walls, the navy, or divine intervention, the coalition eventually gave up and withdrew. Avar power in the Balkans never recovered. But the next threat was bigger than anything Constantinople had faced before, because a new power had exploded out of the Arabian Peninsula, the Umayyad Caliphate, and it had its sights set directly on the Byzantine capital. The first major assault came between 674 and 678 AD, when Umayyad naval forces launched repeated seasonal attacks against the city's sea walls. Constantinople survived thanks to a weapon that has puzzled historians and chemists for over 1,000 years: Greek fire. This was a combustible liquid, launched through bronze tubes mounted on the front of Byzantine warships, that would ignite on contact and burn even on the surface of water. Enemy ships caught fire, and there was almost nothing their crews could do to stop it. The exact formula has been lost to history, but its effect was unmistakable. It broke the siege. The Arabs tried again, and this time even harder. In 717 and 718 AD, a commander named Maslama led an army of roughly 120,000 men and a fleet of 1,800 ships against the city. Emperor Leo III used Greek fire once again to devastate the Arab navy, and then nature stepped in to help finish the job. An unusually brutal winter tore through the besieging army camped outside the walls, and Byzantine diplomacy secured an alliance with the Bulgarian ruler Tervel, whose forces crushed the Arab land army as it tried to retreat. This defeat was so decisive that historians now consider it one of the events that stopped the rapid expansion of the Caliphate into southeastern Europe entirely. Constantinople hadn't just defended itself. It had reshaped the future of the entire continent. And yet, even while it was fending off armies from the outside, the city was tearing itself apart from within over a question of religion. Starting in 726 AD, Emperor Leo III banned the veneration of religious icons, sparking over a century of bitter conflict known as the iconoclastic controversy. This wasn't a quiet theological debate. It split the political and religious elite of the capital, triggered riots, and led to the destruction of countless works of religious art that had survived every siege but couldn't survive their own government's decree. It's a strange pattern in this city's story. The walls could stop nearly any foreign army, but internal division was often just as dangerous as anything outside the gates. And that internal weakness is exactly what would eventually open the door to the single most devastating attack Constantinople would ever suffer. And it wouldn't come from the Arabs, the Persians, or the Avars. It would come from fellow Christians, betrayed by the West, The Fourth Crusade by the 10th and 11th centuries, Constantinople had entered something close to a golden age. Under the Macedonian dynasty, the city became the central hub connecting northern Europe, the Islamic world, and the Mediterranean. Merchants from Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi were granted trading privileges and set up commercial quarters along the Golden Horn. The population swelled back up to somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 people. Scholars preserved classical Greek texts. Missionaries from the city helped bring Christianity and the Cyrillic alphabet to the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe. This was Constantinople at its cultural peak. But there was a slow-building problem underneath all this prosperity. As the empire leaned more and more heavily on Italian merchant fleets for its trade and military support, it was quietly hollowing out its own domestic shipping industry and tax base. And religious tensions between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, simmering for centuries, finally boiled over in 1054, when papal representatives placed a formal bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia itself, and the patriarch excommunicated them right back. East and West were now officially, permanently divided. This split wasn't just theological bookkeeping. It set the stage for one of the darkest betrayals in the city's entire history. In 1202, the armies of the Fourth Crusade set out with the stated goal of retaking Jerusalem. Unable to pay the Venetian Republic for the ships that were transporting them, the Crusader leaders struck a deal with the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo. Help restore a deposed claimant to the Byzantine throne, and Venice would forgive the debt. What was supposed to be a quick diplomatic intervention spiraled into disaster. The restored claimant couldn't pay what he'd promised, and in April of 1204, the Crusader army, made up of fellow Christians who were supposed to be marching toward the Holy Land, turned their weapons on Constantinople itself. Here's the part that made this so devastating. Remember those massive Theodosian land walls that had turned back Persians, Avars, and Arab armies for 800 years? The Crusaders didn't even attack them. Venetian ships fitted with flying bridges attacked the far weaker sea walls along the Golden Horn instead, the softest point in the entire defensive system, and they broke through. What followed was 3 days of looting and destruction. Priceless bronze statues, including the famous horses of Lysippus, were shipped off to Venice, where they still sit atop St. Mark's Basilica today. Hagia Sophia itself was stripped of its relics and golden icons. Fires set during the sack consumed entire residential districts, destroying countless ancient and medieval manuscripts that had survived every previous catastrophe in the city's history. The Crusaders established something called the Latin Empire on the ruins of Byzantine rule, while the exiled Byzantine elite regrouped in places like Nicaea and Epirus, waiting for a chance to take their capital back. That chance came in 1261, when a Nicaean general named Alexios Strategopoulos discovered that the Latin garrison and the Venetian fleet were both away from the city and simply walked a small force in through an unguarded gate, restoring Byzantine rule under Michael VIII Palaiologos almost without a fight. It sounds like a triumphant ending. It wasn't, because the city that was restored in 1261 was not the same city that had been sacked in 1204, and it would never fully recover. This restoration marks the beginning of the empire's final, slow decline, and understanding just how far the city fell in its last 2 centuries makes what happened in 1453 make a lot more sense. The Long Twilight, the Byzantine Empire that emerged from Latin occupation in 1261, was politically fragile and financially broken. The Constantinople that had once housed 500,000 people was now, in large stretches, a landscape of scattered agricultural villages, ruins, orchards, and fields, all still contained within the enormous Theodosian wall circuit that had been built for a city many times its actual size. Economic power had shifted decisively to the Genoese, who ran a fortified trading colony directly across the Golden Horn in a district called Galata. And the numbers here are almost hard to believe. By 1349, that Genoese colony was collecting 200,000 hyperpera a year in customs duties, while the Byzantine imperial treasury, ruling the actual capital of the empire, was collecting only 30,000. The empire was, quite literally, being outcompeted for revenue by a foreign trading post sitting right across the water from its own palace. Then, in 1347, the Black Death arrived by ship from Genoese trading vessels and killed nearly half of the city's already diminished population. Civil wars between rival factions further drained what little strength remained. And meanwhile, a new power was rising across Anatolia and Thrace. The Ottoman Sultanate, which by 1400 had encircled Constantinople so completely that the city was reduced to an isolated enclave, paying tribute just to survive. It briefly caught a lucky break in 1402, when a Mongol conqueror Timur defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara, buying the crumbling empire another 50 years of breathing room. In 1422, the walls held one more time against an Ottoman assault under Sultan Murad II, even against early gunpowder cannons. But by the time a 19-year-old sultan named Mehmed II took the Ottoman throne in 1451, Constantinople's odds had run out almost entirely. In 1453, he brought a force nobody could have imagined the ancient Theodosian walls would ever have to face. 53 days when George Francis, the Byzantine Emperor's own chancellor, conducted a secret census of every able-bodied man in the city in March of 1453. The results were staggering, and not in a good way. Just 4,983 native Greek defenders, plus roughly 2,000 to 3,000 foreign volunteers, mostly Genoese, Venetian, and Catalan soldiers, for a total defending force of around 7,000 to 8,000 men. Emperor Constantine XI was reportedly so alarmed by this number that he ordered it kept secret to prevent panic from spreading through the city. Facing them was an Ottoman army modern historians estimate at 50,000 to 80,000 men, backed by a fleet of over 100 vessels and, most terrifyingly, a battery of roughly 70 cannons, including a massive bombard built by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, capable of firing stone balls weighing up to 1,200 pounds. Mehmed had also constructed a fortress called Rumelihisari at the narrowest point of the Bosporus the year before, cutting off the city from resupply by sea from the north. The siege began on April 6, 1453, with Ottoman cannons targeting the Mesotikian, the section of the land wall where a river valley lowered the wall's natural elevation advantage. For weeks, the pattern repeated itself. Ottoman artillery would blast open sections of the outer wall during the day, and Byzantine defenders, led by a skilled Genoese commander named Giovanni Justiniani, would repair the damage overnight using timber and earth-filled barrels that actually absorbed cannonball impacts better than rigid stone did. Then, on April 22nd, Mehmed pulled off one of the most audacious maneuvers in siege warfare history. The Golden Horn, the city's protected harbor, was sealed off by a massive iron chain stretched across its mouth, a defense that had worked perfectly for centuries. Rather than trying to break the chain, Mehmed had his engineers grease a wooden track over the hills of Galata and physically hauled 70 ships overland, bypassing the chain entirely and depositing his fleet directly into the harbor behind it. Byzantine defenders now had to split their already thin forces to defend a second front they thought had been permanently secure. By late May, Ottoman engineers were also attempting to tunnel beneath the walls, a threat the defenders countered thanks to a Scottish engineer named Johannes Grant, who directed successful countermining operations that flooded or smoked out several Ottoman tunnels. On May 26th, Mehmed called a war council, overruled the more cautious voices among his advisors, and ordered a final, all-out assault for May 29th. That assault began around 1:30 in the morning and came in 3 deliberate waves. First, irregular troops were sent forward, essentially to exhaust the defenders and burn through their ammunition. Then came regular provincial infantry, hurled directly at the battered Mesotikian defenses, but Justiniani's men held the line. Finally, Mehmed committed his elite Janissary reserves, his best troops, save for exactly this moment. During the brutal hand-to-hand fighting that followed, Justiniani himself was severely wounded and evacuated to a ship offshore. His departure caused panic to ripple through the Italian volunteers holding that section of wall, and gaps started opening in the defense. Around the same time, Ottoman troops found or forced their way through a smaller, poorly secured postern gate near the Blicherny section of the walls, known as the Kirkaporta. Whether it was carelessly left open, as later legend claimed, or simply overwhelmed under the chaos of the main assault, historians still debate. What isn't in dispute is what happened next. Ottoman banners began appearing on the towers, and panic spread through the defending forces. Emperor Constantine XI reportedly tore off his imperial regalia so he wouldn't be captured and identified, and charged into the advancing Janissary ranks near the gate of St. Romanos, where he died fighting. His body was later identified only by the distinctive purple boots embroidered with golden eagles that Byzantine emperors alone were permitted to wear. After 1,000 years, 1123 years to be almost exact, from Constantine I's dedication of the city to Constantine XI's death defending it, the Roman Empire in the East was over. What happened next? Ottoman troops were permitted 3 days of plunder, a grim but standard practice under the siege customs of the era. An estimated 4,000 people were killed in the chaos, and roughly 30,000 were captured and sold into slavery. Centuries' worth of classical and theological manuscripts, having survived plagues, riots, earthquakes, and a crusader sack, were now lost, looted, or destroyed in the final hours of the empire that had preserved them. But Mehmed II, now known to history as Mehmed the Conqueror, did something unexpected almost immediately. He rode directly to Hagia Sophia, ordered the looting there stopped on the spot, and performed his prayers inside, converting the cathedral into an imperial mosque rather than destroying it. Understanding that a functioning imperial capital needed people, not just conquerors, he launched a massive resettlement program, relocating Greek, Armenian, Jewish, and Muslim families from across his empire into the city to rebuild its population. He restored the ecumenical patriarchate, appointing a new patriarch and granting the Christian population a degree of self-governance under what became known as the Millet system. And he officially moved the Ottoman capital from Adrianople to this newly conquered city, beginning a transformation that would turn it into the seat of one of the great empires of the early modern world. For historians, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 is often used as the symbolic closing line of the Middle Ages. It cut off traditional overland trade routes to Asia, which is a huge part of why European powers started looking for sea routes instead, eventually launching the age of exploration. And Greek scholars fleeing the fallen capital carried classical manuscripts west into Italy, feeding directly into the intellectual explosion of the Renaissance. A single city, at a single choke point, on a single peninsula, had shaped the ancient world, the medieval world, and now, in its final collapse, helped shape the modern one too. So next time you look at a map and see that narrow strip of water separating Europe from Asia, remember that for over 2,000 years, an entire civilization's fate depended on who controlled that exact spot. If you want to see how empires rise and collapse in far less time than it took Constantinople to fall, and what happens in the power vacuum right after, check out the next video, because that story is just getting started. And if this deep dive into one of history's great turning points was worth your time, you know what to do. See you in the next one.